The desert sun hung low over the Red Rock Valley, painting the canyon walls the color of dried blood. Jacob Thornton stood outside his ranch house, squinting at the horizon where dust devils danced between the sagebrush. His hand rested on the weathered fence post he'd been meaning to replace for 3 years now, ever since Mary passed. The wood felt solid enough under his calloused palm, even if it leaned a bit to the left. "It's not that small," the voice came from behind him, deep and resonant as thunder rolling through the canyons. Jacob spun around so fast his boots kicked up a small cloud of dust. He'd heard stories, of course. Every ranch hand from here to Santa Fe had heard the tales. But hearing about something and seeing it with your own eyes were two entirely different things. She stood between his barn and the water tower, and that alone told him everything he needed to know about her size. The barn roof barely reached her shoulders. She had to be 25, maybe 30 feet tall, with hands that could palm a full-grown steer like a man might hold a kitten. Her dress was patchwork, stitched together from what looked like dozens of canvas tents, dyed a dusty blue that matched the twilight sky. "I said," she repeated, her voice softer this time, but still carrying the weight of distant thunder, "it's not that small." Jacob realized his mouth was hanging open. He snapped it shut, then cleared his throat. "Ma'am, What's not that small?" She gestured with one enormous hand toward his ranch, the house, the barn, the corrals where his dozen cattle grazed, the chicken coop, the vegetable garden Mary had planted, and he'd been too heartbroken to tend properly. "Your place. I was thinking it. I could see it on your face. Standing there all melancholy, looking at what you've built like it doesn't amount to much." Jacob felt heat rise to his cheeks that had nothing to do with the desert sun. "How did you—" "I can read faces pretty well when they're not too far below me. Been watching folks for a long time. You get good at understanding the small details." "Small," Jacob repeated, finding his voice. "No offense, ma'am, but I reckon most everything looks small to you." A smile played at the corners of her mouth. Up close, he could see she wasn't as young as he'd first thought. There were lines around her eyes, gray streaking through the dark hair she'd braided and coiled around her head like a crown. "My name's Eliza Greentree, though that second part's a joke on account of me being taller than most trees." Jacob Thornton. He touched the brim of his hat, then felt foolish. What did you do when meeting a giantess? The etiquette books he'd learned from back east hadn't covered this situation. "I know," Eliza said. "Like I said, I've been watching." "Not in a strange way," she added quickly, seeing his expression. I pass through this valley every few months. Been doing it for years. Usually I'd travel at night, sleep during the day up in the high caves where nobody can see me. But I've noticed your place, noticed how it's changed since your wife passed. I'm sorry about that." Jacob felt his throat tighten. "Thank you, ma'am. That's kind of you to say." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the lowing of cattle and the evening wind whistling through the canyon. Jacob's mind raced. He should probably be afraid. A creature this size could crush his entire ranch without breaking a sweat. But there was something in her eyes, a loneliness he recognized because he saw it every morning in his own shaving mirror. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "Ask away." "How long have you been, were you always big?" Eliza chuckled, and the sound was like a landslide made musical. "No, I grew up normal-sized, believe it or not. Had a regular life, a regular family, a regular husband." She paused, her expression going distant. "Then I got sick, or blessed, or cursed, depending on how you look at it." "What happened?" "Nobody knows for sure. Some kind of fever that swept through our town when I was 23. Most people died. I got taller instead." She held up one massive hand, examining it as if seeing it for the first time. "Took about a month. Every morning I'd wake up bigger. My husband was terrified, then angry, then gone. He left you? Can't say I blame him entirely. By the time I stopped growing, I was already 15 feet tall. Our house couldn't hold me anymore. I was eating enough for 10 people, and we barely had enough for 2. He said he couldn't look at me without feeling small, and I don't mean my size. I mean in himself. I made him feel like he wasn't enough. That's a heavy thing to carry, Jacob thought. Everything's heavier when you're my size, Eliza said, but there was no bitterness in her voice, just acceptance. I've been wandering for 20 years now, found others like me a few times. There's more of us than you'd think, though we tend to keep to the wilderness. Most people don't react well to a 30-foot woman walking through their town. I imagine not. Jacob looked at his ranch again, seeing it through her eyes. The tiny buildings, the small plot of land he'd carved out of the desert through 10 years of backbreaking work. Can I offer you something to drink? I've got water, though I'm not sure I have a cup your size. Eliza's laugh was genuine this time. I've got my own canteen, thank you, but I appreciate the offer. It's been a while since someone treated me like a regular person instead of a monster or a miracle. You seem pretty regular to me, Jacob said, just scaled up considerably. In turn, Jacob told her about the ranch, about Mary and how they'd met, about his struggles to keep the place running alone. He found himself talking about things he hadn't spoken of in years, his fears that he'd never amount to much, that the ranch was too small to matter, that he'd spent his life on something that would be forgotten the moment he died. See, that's what I meant earlier, Eliza said when he finished. You're looking at what you've built like it's nothing. But Jacob, you've made a life here, a home. You've got cattle that depend on you, land that you've tended, a legacy from the woman you loved. That's not small. That's everything. It's easier for you to say, Jacob replied, though not unkindly. You've seen the whole world. You know what's out there. And you know what's right here, Eliza gestured at the ranch. I've seen grand cities and mighty mountains, vast oceans and endless plains. You want to know what I see when I look at your place? I see a man who gets up every morning and does the work even though it hurts. I see someone who keeps promises even when nobody would blame him for breaking them. I see a home, Jacob, a real one. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Jacob felt something shift in his chest, like a stone he'd been carrying had suddenly lightened. I never thought about it that way. Most people don't. They spend so much time looking up at bigger things that they forget to appreciate what they're standing on. Eliza smiled. Take it from someone who's always looking down. Sometimes the most important things are the smallest ones. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Jacob found himself telling Eliza about his plans for the ranch, the dreams he'd put aside, the improvements he'd been too discouraged to attempt. She listened with genuine interest, asking questions, offering suggestions from her unusual perspective. You know what you could do with that south pasture? She said at one point. There's a spring about 2 miles up in the hills. I've seen it when I travel through. If you ran a pipe down here, you could water twice the land. I'd never find it. Spent weeks looking for water up there when I first claimed this land. I could show you. Tomorrow, if you'd like. I'll be here until sunset anyway. I prefer not to travel in daylight where people might see me. He looked up at her, this impossible woman who'd wandered into his life out of nowhere. Why are you being so kind to me? Eliza was quiet for a long moment. Because you didn't run. Because you offered me a drink even though you didn't have a cup big enough. Because you looked at me and saw a person, not a problem. She paused. And because I know what it's like to feel small, even when you're big. They made an odd pair the next morning, the lonely rancher and the giantess, heading up into the hills as the sun climbed toward noon. Eliza moved with surprising grace for someone her size, stepping carefully to avoid crushing sagebrush, using her height to scout the terrain ahead. Jacob rode his horse, following in her shadow, which was large enough to keep both him and his mount cool, even in the desert heat. True to her word, Eliza led him to a spring he'd never have found on his own, tucked into a fold of rock that was invisible from below. The water bubbled up, clear and cold, already forming a small stream that disappeared into the earth after only a few dozen yards. "This feeds into an underground river," Eliza explained, kneeling beside the spring. "If you dig down about 15 feet where that stream goes into the ground, you'll hit the main flow. Pipe it from there, and you'll have water year-round." Jacob sat on a boulder, mind already racing with possibilities. This could change everything. I could triple my herd, plant crops, maybe even... He trailed off, embarrassed by his own enthusiasm. Maybe even what? Maybe even stop feeling like I'm just barely hanging on, he admitted. Maybe even build something worth building. "There it is again," Eliza said gently. "That idea that what you've already built doesn't count. Jacob, listen to me. You've been surviving alone in one of the hardest places on earth for 3 years. You've kept Mary's memory alive by staying here, by tending what she loved. You've already built something worth building. This spring, it's just going to make it easier, that's all." Jacob looked up at her, this strange friend he'd found in the most unlikely of places. "How do you stay so positive, after everything that's happened to you?" Eliza settled herself more comfortably on the hillside, her back against a cliff face. "I had a choice to make when I stopped growing. I could spend my life angry at what I'd lost, or I could find new things to appreciate. I chose the latter. Doesn't mean I don't get lonely sometimes. Doesn't mean I don't miss being normal-sized, being able to walk into a building or hold someone's hand without worrying I'll hurt them." She held up one massive hand, examining it. "But I can see things nobody else can see. I can reach places nobody else can reach. And every once in a while, I can help someone find a spring that might change their life." "You've helped me with more than just the spring," Jacob said quietly. They spent the afternoon marking the route for the pipeline, with Eliza using her height advantage to spot the best path down the hill. By the time the sun began its descent, they'd worked out a plan that would take Jacob most of the winter to complete, but would transform his ranch by spring. As they walked back, Eliza taking slow, careful steps to let Jacob's horse keep pace, she told him more stories about her travels. She described a valley in the north where hot springs formed natural pools large enough for her to bathe in, a forest in the east where the trees grew tall enough that she could walk through them without having to duck, a canyon in the south where she had found cave paintings of figures that looked like her, suggesting she wasn't the first of her kind. "There's a whole history we don't know about," she said. "People like me. Giants who lived and loved and died without anyone remembering them. Makes you think about legacy differently, about what really matters." By the time they reached the ranch, the sky was streaked with orange and gold. Eliza walked Jacob back to his house, then began gathering her things, a pack made from wagon canvas, a canteen fashioned from a water tower, a bedroll that looked like it had been sewn from a circus tent. "You're leaving tonight?" Jacob asked, surprised at how much the thought disappointed him. "I move on every few months. It's safer that way, for me and for the people near wherever I stop. But I'll come back through. I always do." She smiled down at him. "Besides, I want to see what you do with that water once you get it running." "I wish you could stay longer," Jacob said, then felt foolish for saying it. What could she do here? Where would she sleep? How would she even fit into his life? But Eliza's expression softened. "That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in years. But you've got work to do, Jacob Thornton. A pipeline to build, a ranch to expand, a life to live. You don't need a giant woman hanging around making you feel small." "You don't make me feel small," Jacob said firmly. "You make me feel like maybe I'm bigger than I thought I was." Eliza knelt down. She had to get close to his level, and extended one enormous hand. Jacob stepped forward and placed his palm against one of her fingers. It was the closest thing to a handshake they could manage, and somehow it felt more meaningful than any normal handshake he had ever shared. "You take care of yourself," she said softly. "And remember, it's not the size of what you build that matters, it's the love you put into building it." "I'll remember," Jacob promised. "And Eliza, thank you for everything." She stood then, shouldering her pack. "You're welcome, Jacob. It was nice to have a friend for a while." "You'll always have a friend here," he called up to her. "Any time you pass through, you're welcome, day or night, small ranch or not." Eliza's laugh echoed through the canyon as she began walking north, her footsteps shaking the ground just enough that Jacob could feel them through his boots. He watched until she disappeared around a bend in the canyon wall, her silhouette briefly outlined against the rising moon before the darkness swallowed her completely. That night, Jacob sat on his porch and looked at his ranch with new eyes. The barn that needed a new roof, the fence that leaned to the left, the garden he'd neglected, the house that felt too big for one person but too small for the memories it held. None of it had changed, but somehow everything was different. He thought about what Eliza had said, about small things being important, about legacy and love and the work of living. He thought about her loneliness and his own, about how two people who couldn't be more different had somehow understood each other perfectly. The next morning, Jacob began digging. The pipeline took 4 months to complete. It was back-breaking work, digging through rocky soil, hauling pipe he'd purchased with the last of his savings, connecting sections by lamplight when the days grew too short. There were times he wanted to quit, times he wondered if he was crazy for trying, times he thought about how much easier it would be to give up and sell the place. But he remembered Eliza's words. He remembered the way she'd looked at his ranch and seen something worth preserving, and he kept digging. When the water finally came through on a cold February morning, Jacob stood in his south pasture and watched the spring water bubble up through the pipe into the trough he'd built. It was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. By spring, new grass covered the pasture. By summer, his herd had doubled. By fall, he'd replanted Mary's garden and had enough vegetables to sell in town. By winter, he'd hired 2 ranch hands and repaired the barn roof, and finally, felt like he was building something that would last. He thought about Eliza often during those months, wondered where she was, what she was seeing, whether she ever thought about the lonely rancher and his small ranch in Red Rock Valley. He hoped she did. He hoped she knew that she'd changed his life. The following spring, just after sunset on a warm April evening, Jacob was sitting on his porch when he felt the ground shake. Not an earthquake, something more rhythmic, more deliberate. He smiled and stood up, walking out to meet her. Eliza came around the canyon bend like a mountain coming to life, her footsteps steady and sure. She'd let her hair down, and it flowed behind her like a dark river. She was smiling. "I'll be damned," she said, her voice carrying across the valley. "You did it." Jacob gestured proudly at his ranch, the green pasture, the fat cattle, the rebuilt barn, the thriving garden. "Couldn't have done it without you." "Oh, I think you could have," Eliza said, settling herself into her usual spot between the barn and the water tower. "But I'm glad I could help." They talked through the night, catching up like old friends do. Eliza told him about a town she'd passed near where people had actually waved at her instead of running. Jacob told her about his ranch hands, about the first harvest from Mary's garden, about how he'd started to feel less like he was surviving and more like he was living. "See," Eliza said, as dawn began to pink the eastern sky. "Told you it wasn't that small." "No," Jacob agreed, looking at everything he'd built, everything he'd preserved, everything he'd become. "I guess it's not." Eliza visited 3 more times that year, each visit lasting a little longer than the last. Jacob began to plan for her arrivals, setting aside extra food, clearing a space for her to rest, looking forward to their conversations the way he'd once looked forward to Saturday night dances back when Mary was alive. On her final visit of the year in late November, when the first snow was beginning to dust the canyon rims, Eliza brought something with her, a wooden chair, carefully carved and sized perfectly for Jacob, with his name etched into the back. "I made it myself," she said, almost shyly. "Took me 3 months of working at night. Figured you could use a proper chair for the porch." Jacob ran his hand over the smooth wood, marveling at the craftsmanship. The idea of those enormous hands doing such delicate work moved him deeply. "It's beautiful. Thank you,"